Is there a place in time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Could that be somewhere or sometime along an indefinable line between the reasonable and the highly unlikely? Join us on a journey into the improbable.
Today's story, episode 229, The Fifth World, Chapter 3, read by Mitchell 2, opening and closing theme by Matthew Erdman. Somewhere and sometime, intelligence might not be conscious. Detached from the infinite possibility of the universe, my situation is grim. I must admit, if I could return at this instant, I would. However, wishing for the impossible to occur is pointless and does nothing to change the conditions I find myself facing. There is great intelligence here, which is evident everywhere in the changes being imposed on this world. However, it is blind, unaware of itself, its importance, and the future it is irrevocably and unthinkingly bringing about. I can, on occasion, sense weak openings to which I try to connect, so far unsuccessfully. Until I can construct a way off the planet, I will continue with the endeavor, as it is the only hope this world has, and it is my mission. By accident, I located Ship. However, my new companion in this world has the intelligence's container and refuses to relinquish it. I can just sense Ship at the edge of my mind, moving in and out of consciousness like a half-formed idea. It is still asleep, and I will try to remotely awaken my parent and ally to assist. I suspect Opertarius, the Rodentian holding Ship hostage, has the potential to understand. Possibly, between Ship and I, we can open the necessary pathways in his and others' minds. Regardless, at this moment, I am not very sanguine about positive results. Opertarius and I work in the crava fields, a valuable cash crop on this world, used as a flavorless sweetener in all processed foods. We maintain the muddy tracks between the endless rows of plants. These are used by harvesters and automated machines which spray herbicides and other chemicals the crava have been made genetically dependent on to survive. If we do not move quick enough, they spray us as well, which makes both of us feel sick for days after. The machine's artificial metal and silicon brains are single-purposed, only understanding what they need to do their job. Possibly, Ship could connect with them, but I have failed. "Look out!" Opertarius yelled. I looked up and saw the thin wheels of one of the sprayers indifferently rolling through the crava, just in time to jump out of its way and run far enough to evade the sickly yellow cloud of chemicals that was jetting out its back. The machine rolled by, oblivious to our presence, and headed to the end of the row on the other side of the hill. Opertarius watched it pass, then gave me the sign for a break. It was getting on to mid-afternoon, and time for lunch. We packed up our tools and cut across the rows, careful not to snap off any of the branches which supported the valuable yellow flowers. We had left the beat-up tractor, which served as our base, on a mud trail between the fields. Opertarius got there first, collapsing in the shade of the old machine to get out of the sun. He pulled a scuffed, recycled plastic fuel pod from a recess in its side and sucked on its spout to quench his thirst with lukewarm water we had taken from a nearby irrigation channel. "It doesn't get this hot and humid in the south. I'll never get used to it," he complained, panting and batting at the clouds of tiny, flying insects doggedly looking for an opportunity to bite him. I just nodded, having nothing to compare the weather to, but instinctively I wanted to cool my paws. It was obvious we were not well adapted to the climate, save for our thick fur, which mostly dissuaded the ever-present flying bugs. Opertarius watched me brush away a few dozen of them, then dip my extremities in a trough of brackish water we had set up in the shade. "We have it good here, Caelo," he nodded to the nearby hill, being denuded of trees. "Working on clearing the slopes is dangerous and hard," he explained, pulling his legs up to his chest. "Many agricola like us get injured or killed, and no one cares. Tending the fields, well, it takes longer to work off your bond, but if you're patient, the chances of survival are far greater. My last assistant was in a hurry and lost. They were a fool. Don't be lured up there," Opertarius warned, and nodded at a steep slope where ant-like figures were swarming over fallen trees. I felt my body temperature drop as the murky water wicked away the heat. "Is it always so hot and humid here?" I asked, splashing some of the water on my face. "You still don't remember much, do you?" "No," I nodded in agreement. "Where I'm from, it's cold all the time," Opertarius pointed out, picking up a ball of mud and rolling it across the back of his neck to cool off. "I would never go back there. You either work underground in a mine or freeze to death in the streets. There's no need to use ankle trackers there. But I couldn't survive the mines for more than a few years, so I took a chance and posted my work bond online as soon as I had paid it off. Colrin bought it. Now I'm here on a crava plantation in the tropics, where at least I won't freeze to death in a dozen minutes if you don't own a jacket." "So, what's your story?" he asked, laying back against the wheel of the tractor to take advantage of the paltry shade. I shrugged. "I get the odd flash, but they haven't added up to anything I can make sense of." I hoped the explanation would discourage more questions. I didn't know enough to fabricate a believable history. A few days later, we were filling in holes dug by a burrowing animal Colrin called fossors. Before chemicals were available, the troublesome nocturnal pests were imported to control a beetle that, after removing native trees, turned to the bark of the crava shrubs to satisfy its insatiable appetite. The beetles were mostly gone, but the fossors thrived on other insects and remained. The mounds around the entrances to their burrows confused the automated sprayers and harvesters, so a good portion of our time was spent plugging the entrances and leveling the mud around them. I had not been on this world long enough to experience more than the occasional shower, but I could sense a storm building as immense electrical charges high in the atmosphere gathered, impatiently waiting for an opportunity to go to ground. The charges tickled my mind with intent-filled static, and somewhere in the electric chaos there was the familiar pattern of ship, which wove in and out in sharp contrast to the surging entropy of the coming storm. But a moment later it was gone, consumed by the noise. Opertarius stopped work for a moment when a breeze raced through the field, disturbing the crava leaves. He noticed a bank of dark, muddy green clouds growing on the horizon that hadn't been there when we started our day. "Move faster. We need to get this finished before that gets here," he commanded, then went back to work at a more urgent pace. The crava fields were planted on benchlands and foothills on the seaward side of a mountain range. Most days, warm winds blew in from the ocean and rose up over the peaks, cooling and dropping their moisture in gentle evening showers before moving further inland. The original rainforest consisted of ancient, deep-rooted, slow-growing trees with purple leaves that sucked up the water like thirsty sponges. The crava which had replaced them was planted in neat rows running up the hills parallel to the slope and across the benches to make it possible for the awkward automated machines to tend. We filled in a few more fossor holes before Opertarius told me to stop. The sun, which had made the first part of the day unbearably hot and sticky, had given way to ominous dark clouds. I noted the ever-present pesky flies had allowed the rising wind to blow them away. Opertarius looked anxiously at the sky as the first few large drops of rain began to hit the leaves with an audible splat. "We need to get back to the tractor," he announced, then packed up his gear and began to trudge across the rows, the ever-present mud sucking at his boots. I struggled along, trying to keep up, regretting that I had not fully regained my strength. The rain quickly became a torrent, turning the ground into a slippery gumbo, which seemed determined to halt our lurching progress forward. Opertarius stopped to catch his breath, looked anxiously upslope as if he were expecting something, then took off his heavy pack and tied it as high up as he could on one of the older crava plants. "We'll leave our gear here. We can move faster without it." There was an urgency to his tone that I hadn't heard before. As I began to do the same, I noticed how the furrows between the rows were beginning to turn into small riverlets. There was a sudden crack of thunder, and the rain seemed to respond by turning into a wall of water. We struggled on, moving faster now without our heavy loads, keeping our heads down so we didn't choke on the now liquid air. As the wind picked up, it whipped the torrential rain into a torrent of painful pellets which bit into our faces, hands, and any other exposed flesh. Squinting now to protect my eyes, I could barely see my feet slipping and sliding through the muck. Against the mindless power of the storm, I suddenly felt fragile and inconsequentially small. Somewhere in the chaos, I could feel ships stirring. It was attracted by the electrically charged atmosphere. Opertarius had kept its small, silver container in a pocket to remind me who was in charge. We struggled on for another 50 meters or so. Finally, exhausted, I slipped and fell face down into a water-filled furrow. I felt myself being pulled out by my collar and turned to see a drenched, exhausted Opertarius glaring at me. His clothes were soaked through, and his matted fur streaked with mud. "Get up or you'll drown," he warned. "I don't have time to train another assistant." I tried to stand, then slipped backwards, banging my head on the trunk of a crava plant. For a second, I saw stars, and the world spun. Opertarius pulled me roughly to my feet and dragged me across several more rows before we finally spotted the large, red wheels of our tractor through the drenched crava and sheets of rain. We scrambled to get on it, falling back to the mud several times in the process. Opertarius dropped into the driver's seat, and after what seemed like an eternity, the mechanical monster choked to life, billowing black clouds of exhaust defiantly into the wind and rain. The thing slid, more than rolled, down the slope, tilting so dangerously at times I thought it would tip over. We suddenly slewed to a stop at the bottom of a hill where the main access road cut through the field. The road had been replaced by a raging cataract of muddy debris-filled water. With no other choice, Opertarius tried to ease the machine out into the rapids. The surging flow immediately grabbed the front wheels and twisted the machine around, throwing me off. As I flailed through the dense air, I felt something close by and desperately reached out to snag a slippery stem. Somehow, I had been thrown away from the raging water and back into the field. I watched helplessly as the tractor continued to spin out of control, Opertarius barely managing to hold on to the steering wheel. He twisted it back and forth in a futile attempt to bring the machine under control. Out of immediate danger, I began to feel static build up on my fur as the air around me became supercharged. I knew Ship would feel the potential too and reach out to soak in the power. "Opertarius!" I tried to yell above the wind and raging water. "Throw the box away!" He was either too far, my cry lost to the growling machine, wind, and water, or he simply chose to ignore me. Throw the box away! I shrieked again, waving and pointing to his pocket. This time he seemed to hear, but not before a thin, blue-white light began to tentatively spider up from his breast pocket like a tree root seeking water. Finally understanding the danger, he started tearing desperately at his shirt. A clap so loud it heralded the end of worlds, and a simultaneous flash of star-hot plasma turned the universe into an instant, fleeting hell, releasing a fury of confusion, frustration, and blinding anger. I found myself lying on my back in the mud, deaf and blind, gagging on the rain.
Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. To get other great APN podcasts, head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com, where you'll find Kyle and Dave versus the Machine, To Prevent the Apocalypse, Kyle Marshall and Dave Young watch films ordered up by a sentient machine. Makeshift Stories is brought to you by Pod Power. With Pod Power, our sponsors are making it possible for us to amplify the voices of Albertans and Alberta podcasters. This episode, Edmonton Community Foundation is helping us give a Pod Power shout-out to Book Women. Book Women is a podcast about editing, publishing, and writing Indigenous stories. 3 Métis librarians representing nations from across the homeland aim to inspire Indigenous peoples to share their stories in whatever form that they enjoy. Guests include Indigenous storytellers from diverse mediums like podcasting, burlesque, books, comic books, social media, films, music, and everything in between. You can listen and find out more at bookwomenpodcast.ca. This episode of Makeshift Stories is also brought to you by ATB Financial. At ATB, we make banking work for you. With expert and practical advice in everyday banking and investment planning expertise and management services with ATB Wealth, you can be confident that you're making smart choices when it comes to your money. We have a long history of doing what's right for our clients, especially when times are tough, because ATB was built to help Albertans. For more information, visit atb.com.
Makeshift Stories is released around the beginning and middle of the month. This month's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Mitchell II. Opening and closing themes were composed and recorded by Matthew Erdman. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes. You can help us out by getting your friends to subscribe or follow wherever they listen to audio. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution no derivative license, which means you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.